fatal blight hit Ireland. And it was almost like it happened overnight. People went to bed in August of 1845 expecting to wake up and have the same bumper crop of potatoes they had done before, but instead they woke up to the smell of potatoes rotting in the ground. You know when a potato goes so bad it's black and mushy? That's what the blight was doing to the potatoes. So they were completely inedible. Now in that year, 1845, 40% of the crop failed. So it wasn't a complete disaster just yet, but people, they couldn't understand how it was happening and how they could prevent it from happening in the future. And they tried various things. Some people went out into the fields with holy water and spread it along the crop in an effort to save it, but unfortunately that didn't work. In the following year, the entire crop failed. And then the year after that, 1847, that became known as Black 47. Because not only did the entire crop fail again, but at that point, people were worn down with hunger and starvation. And there were diseases like cholera and typhoid beginning to spread and kill people in their hundreds and thousands. Now, there was very little help coming from abroad at this time. And any kind of workhouses or soup kitchens people tried to establish, they weren't resolving the problem. So it became a situation of get out of the country or die. So what do people do? They chose to get out of the country. And the destination for many of these people was the New World, America and Canada. That was the place to go. So people were herded onto these ships, which became known as coffin ships. Now I'll describe the ships and you'll understand how that name came about. The space that people had on these ships was about twice the size of this room, but there would have been almost 300 people crammed into that space for a journey which could last up to 10 weeks. There were 3 level bunk beds for people to sleep on, and people were brought upstairs for 30 minutes in the day for some food. Now, as you can imagine, with people being in such close proximity to each other, the ones who had diseases like cholera and typhoid would spread it. And people quite often died at sea and had to be buried at sea. Parents burying children and children burying parents. And it really was, by far, it was the most tragic period in Irish history. But even though it's a huge part of our history, but there's very little folklore. There's very few stories about the famine. And this is because Irish people for a long time just didn't want to talk about it because of what we had to go through during that time. But that's not to say that it didn't affect the Irish psyche quite deeply. And you see that sometimes when something arises in the country, and Irish people, we've got a very unique way of responding to certain things. And for example, I'm sure a lot of you probably, do you guys remember the outbreak of foot and mouth disease in Britain about 15 or 16 years ago? And of course, it was rampant in Britain. It was right on our doorstep here in Ireland, so we locked the country down. Everybody had to sterilise their shoes going into any public building, be it a shop or a school or a pub, sterilise their shoes on the way out again. Any big gatherings like community events or sporting events, they were cancelled or postponed. Because the Irish mentality was, do not let disease back into the country, because you've seen the destruction it can do. So it is at times like that you realise it's still there. What Irish people went through during the famine still affects the way that we feel about things and the way we respond. But after the famine, on past 1850, this emigration of Irish people continued. But at that point, the dynamic really started to change in Ireland. There was no longer a situation where farmers could subdivide their land and everybody in the family would inherit a plot of land. Now it was usually just one member of the family that actually got the land. So if that wasn't you, it was your brother or your sister who got the land, then your options were quite slim. If you were a man, you had 2 options. You could choose to stay and you could work as an unpaid labourer for your brother or sister, which wouldn't be great, or you could emigrate, go to the New World and try to build life for yourself elsewhere. And I was a little bit confused about this at first, but as it happens, more women actually emigrated than men during this time, which at first I thought was kind of strange. I was assuming, 19th century, it would be the men going to get the jobs. But it does actually make sense if you really look at the situation. Because let's say you're a young woman living in a village, all the men that inherited the land have gotten married, and then the bachelors left over are just working as unpaid labourers. You might as well just take your chances to go to the new world. Seems to be fine over there. So they were quite smart women in the 19th century. And then of course, even after we got our independence, we still didn't have the infrastructure to support our population. So throughout the generations, we have just continued to emigrate, and we really have spread ourselves all around the world. So it's not surprising that we have a diaspora of about 70 million people around the world today. Out of curiosity, how many of you guys here have Irish ancestry? Oh, loads of you. Brilliant. Welcome home. And where is everybody from? Hands up who's from the States this evening. Oh Lord. Okay. Is there anybody left over there at all? What other countries do we have?
Argentina.
Argentina, lovely, very good. And where? Portugal, lovely.
Canada.
Oh, Canada, lovely.
Massachusetts.
Do you guys know each other? Yeah. Any Irish? No? Tell you what, you will all just be Irish with me tonight, will you? Okay. Now, even though Irish people are very plentiful everywhere in the world, and of course particularly in the New World, like in America, it took a long time for Irish people to establish themselves in their new environment. And of course, in the New World, like in America, if you wanted to establish yourself, what were you going to do? Of course, today you'd probably do American Idol or something like that, but looking into the past, you might have gone into the route of politics. So Irish people aspired to becoming mayors and governors. Then of course in the 1960s, John F. Kennedy hit the big time and became president. And when he came to visit Ireland in 1963, have you seen, I don't know if you've seen the footage of that visit, but it was like the big homecoming. Irish people just flocked out to see him. And he was held in such high regard by Irish people, not just because he was the president of the United States, of course that was something, but it was because of what he symbolised. Because he himself was from an Irish immigrant background. He was Irish Catholic, and if he could achieve that pinnacle of being the president of the United States, that meant that the opportunities for Irish immigrants around the world were just boundless. So he was so highly regarded by Irish people. I must actually tell you, when I was a child, I didn't have any understanding of that whatsoever, and I was so confused every time I went to my grandparents' house. Because I'd walk in the door, and in the hallway there were two pictures looking at me. Pope John Paul and John F. Kennedy. Could never fathom why, but that shows you just how highly regarded he was of the Pope. So, as you can see, the humble potato, it just had a huge impact on our history. But of course, with it being our main source of food, we had to be a little bit creative, because as nice as it is, having it for breakfast, lunch and dinner would be slightly tedious. Would you like to have potatoes for breakfast, lunch and dinner? No, not so much, I'm with you there. So we would cook potatoes in a lot of different ways. We had potato cakes, we had boxty, which were like pancakes, we had colcannon. Has anybody ever had colcannon? Oh yeah? Did you like it?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's good.
If you said no, I'd show you the door there. We really like colcannon in Ireland. It's a very, very simple dish, but very tasty. You can make it at home with just potatoes, cabbage or kale, onions and butter. Loads of butter. More butter than potatoes, I think that's the secret really. But we like colcannon so much, we even used to write poetry about it. And there's one little poem that goes, did you ever eat colcannon when it was made with yellow cream, and the kale and praties blended like a picture in a dream? Did you ever make a hole on top to fill the melting lake with the clover-flavoured butter that your mother used to make? So we love our colcannon, as you can see. Now, colcannon was particularly popular around the festival of Samhain. And you might be thinking that you've never come across Samhain before, but you'd know it a lot better as Halloween. I'm sure everybody's familiar with Halloween. Now, Samhain, or Halloween as we call it today, was a very important festival here in Ireland first. And it's one of those things that went over to the New World with the Irish emigrants, and it was sent back to us in a bigger, better format with lots of improvements. I do mean that. We were actually carving faces into turnips for generations to scare away the spirits, so thank you for the pumpkins. But as I said, it was a very important festival here in Ireland first. And Samhain celebrated two things. First of all, it was the festival of the dead. And death in Ireland has always been a really big thing. Have you guys all heard about the Irish Wake? Yeah? An Irish Wake can go on for days and days on end. We like to give people a good big send-off, basically just to make sure they don't come back. It's working so far, so we keep it up. And then Samhain also celebrated the beginning of the Celtic year. And people believed that at this time of year, the things that happened to them, they were like predictions of what would happen for the rest of the year. So if they were to play divination games, they could kind of predict what their luck was going to be like. This is where the colcannon came into play, because girls would take the colcannon, they'd place a ring and a thimble into it and mix it all up. Now, if you were the girl to get the ring, that was great. That meant you were going to meet your true love, you were going to get married, live happily ever after. If you were the girl to get the thimble, probably time to emigrate. Just see what there. People had lots of other games, but possibly the most peculiar thing that people would do is they would eat salted herring before going to bed at night. Because they believed by eating that salted herring, that was going to make them dream of their true love standing at the end of their bed holding a glass of water. So obviously that is quite peculiar, but there is kind of a scientific basis for that, because apparently if you eat salt before you go to bed, your dreams will actually be more vivid. So you can give it a try. I'm not I haven't been with Colin Farrell for years and I'm still waiting. So I will tell you more about Samhain later, because as I said, it was a very important festival. But moving away from the potato, the other main food we had was buttermilk. And buttermilk was just the leftovers after making butter. If you were making butter, that meant you are one of the lucky Irish families that has a cow. And that's what Irish people aspired to having, because it was such a good source of income to have a cow. So if you had a cow, you're going to look after that cow. What's your name, sir?
John.
John, where are you from, John?
U.S., Ohio.
Ohio, okay. From a city or a country or?
City.
Okay, this might be a challenge for you, but John, let's just say you're a farmer in 19th century Ireland.
Okay.
Okay? You have a cow. You have to give her a name. What would you like to name your cow?
Bessie.
Great, so you have Bessie the cow. Let's say it's a lovely Irish summer, the sun is shining, so you let Bessie out into the field to graze and enjoy the sunshine, yeah?
Okay.
But when the cold Irish winter comes, are you going to leave Bessie out in the cold?
She can sleep at the foot of the bed.
Basically, yes. Yeah, because, well, you're too poor to have a barn as well, so Bessie's coming right into the house with you, which, I mean, it's a great source of heat. You know, having a cow on the bottom of your bed is a pretty good source of heat. But John, are there problems with that scenario as well?
It's a pretty good source of smell as well, I would imagine.
It'll get a bit messy. When Bessie does her business, are you going to take that muck and just dispose of it and never think of it again, or are you going to keep it?
Probably have to keep it as fertilizer.
Very good, yeah, that's one of the reasons. Then there's another reason too, maybe the room could help out? Fuel, exactly. So fuel and fertilizer, those are your two reasons. But the fertilizer, that's kind of like your number one reason, because the more muck you have for fertilizer, the better your potatoes will be. So John, you will actually be quite proud of this muck. So you won't even just keep the muck, you keep it very, very close to you. You will keep it right outside your front door, in your front garden, because what you want all the other farmers to walk by and they'll just be so jealous of your big load of muck outside your house. There was even a saying, where there is muck, there is luck. Is it a bit different in Ohio?
No, it's pretty much the same. We put a bunch of crap in the front of our house to make everybody jealous. That's the way we do it.
No, do not go to Ohio. Thank you very much, John. Thank you. Now, as well as Bessie the cow, you might have also had a pig, and the pig was known as the gentleman who pays the rent, because you could sell the pig around November time and make a huge contribution to your rent. If you were lucky enough to have covered your rent and you still had the pig left over, then you would slaughter the pig and you would share it with all of your family and your neighbours. You would not let anything go to waste. Every single part of the pig was used. You'd take some of the pig's blood and put it on your doorstep to keep evil spirits away. Apparently the bladder was used as a football by children, which is a lovely thought. Would you like to use a bladder as a football? No? 19th century Ireland is just not for you, is it? And then of course you keep the really good part, like the ham or the bacon. You'd hang that up just by the fire so that during the week it would get nice and smoky. Then on a Sunday, you'd take a bit of it down, you'd have your bacon, your cabbage and your potatoes. The peasants' Sunday dinner, and it was a real treat. Now, I must clarify as well, for a lot of you that are from the States, you're probably wondering about corned beef. But again, kind of like Samhain, like Halloween, corned beef is another one of those things that went over to the New World, and it has become more of an Irish-American dish, really, than an Irish dish. The first time I ever had corned beef was in New York on St. Patrick's Day. Corned beef came about because there was a belief in Ireland, no matter how poor you are, you should not be without meat on the festive occasions like Christmas and Samhain. So on these occasions, the wealthier farmers would take some beef, they would salt it down and give it to the poorer families. So, as you can see, there was no real haute cuisine in Ireland. Food was very, very simple and very basic. And Irish people's relationship with food, it's always been something that's more about survival than enjoyment of food, and that is still kind of there in the Irish mentality with our relationship with food. And what opened my eyes to that was when I was in the States for a while, and I was there for Thanksgiving, and I was there for a wedding as well, and oh, there was so much food. There was always something there to nibble on and enjoy, and all these different tastes and flavours. Something like an Irish wedding would be very different to that. At an Irish wedding, you sit down, you get the food into you, then get on with the drinking and the dancing. Those are priorities. But what you will see from the food that you get tonight, it's not haute cuisine. It's simple, tasty, wholesome food. It's what I call a mammy dinner. It's the sort of food my mother made for me when I was growing up. So just that lovely, warm, comfort food. So I hope you're going to enjoy it. That is the food lore of Ireland. So in a few moments, your starters will come in. I'll walk around the room a little bit as well. If you've got any questions about anything I've spoken about, feel free to ask me. And after your starters, I will come back and talk to you about the Faeries. Okay, enjoy your starters. Century. And when Christianity came into Ireland, they didn't come in all guns blazing. They came in with a very sort of evolutionary approach as opposed to revolution. So they actually adopted a lot of the pagan beliefs that were already in place. And it's because of this very slow, gradual process that the belief in the Faeries and the belief in the Christian God coexisted. People believed in both at the same time, which is difficult to comprehend, but somehow they made it work. But if you wanted to find out the origin of the Faeries, if you want to know where the Faeries come from, you're going to find lots of different stories. Because you'll find stories that are pre-Christian, and then you'll get stories that are post-Christian. Because as the belief in the Christian God got stronger and stronger, people started to wonder, well, how did the Faeries come about in relation to God? God created humans. Did he create the Faeries as well? What happened? Where did they come from? And some of you might know the story of God and Lucifer and their big battle in heaven. Of course, some angels went on God's side, some angels went on Lucifer's side. Then there were just a few angels who decided to sit on the fence and see how things panned out. Now, when God defeated Lucifer, he sent Lucifer and those angels straight to hell. But then he also sent the angels that had sat on the fence. And as those angels were all falling down towards hell, the archangel Michael intervened. And he said, listen, God, I know they're not good enough to be in heaven, but surely they're not bad enough to go to hell, so have some mercy on them. And God said, okay, fine. Oh, he was Irish, by the way. Very important. He said, wherever they land right now, let them remain. So some of them landed in the mountains, some in the sea, some in the clouds, some in the trees, and they became the fairies of all of these different elements. But now, this new story that the church introduced, it basically meant the fairies were fallen angels. So then, you weren't going to worship them. You might still believe in the fairies, but you wouldn't worship them like you worshipped the Christian God. So, God took the front seat and the fairies took a back seat. But when I am talking about fairies, I have to distinguish between two different kinds. We have trooping fairies and solitary fairies. And I'll tell you about the trooping fairies first, because they're the most common. They're called trooping fairies because of their movement throughout the year. They move from their summer to their winter quarters. And it's on Samhain Eve, on Halloween, that this movement occurs. And of course nowadays, Halloween, everybody's out trick-or-treating, it's all fun and games. In 19th century Ireland, people would lock themselves indoors so as not to come across the trooping fairies. Because if you came across them, dreadful things could happen to you. Possibly the worst case scenario would be they would take you back to the other world. Now, some people never returned. They disappeared to the other world and their families never saw them again. Others who managed to escape and they returned back to their families, they were never quite the same afterwards. It had a terrible effect on their minds having been in the other world. And while you're in Ireland, you might hear Irish people using a certain phrase. Sometimes Irish people say, oh, you're away with the fairies, or you're off with the fairies, or you're gone with the fairies. That basically means you're a little bit too laddie. Nobody wants to be taken by the fairies. It would not have good consequences on your well-being. But possibly the most frightening thing about the trooping fairies is that they looked human. I mean, any one of you could actually be a trooping fairy for all I know. I do have suspicions about a few, I'm not going to lie. But there were times when you were interacting with somebody and you had to make sure the person you're interacting with was not a trooping fairy, particularly if there was money involved. Because if you took money from a trooping fairy, you were guaranteed to get home, open your bag, and the money would have turned into dust. So something that was very useful to know about the trooping fairies is that even though they looked human, they hated anything dirty. They hated germs. For all the world, they were a little bit OCD. So if you were trading cattle at a market and you had to make sure the person you're taking money from is not a trooping fairy, does anyone have any idea how you might be able to do that?
Probably use the muck in front of my front door.
Good guess. But not exactly, but good guess though, good guess. Any other ideas? It's something to do with the shaking of the hand. Spitting on the hand, exactly. Very good, very good. You just go, spit on the hand, shake hands with them. And if the person shook your hand, excellent, do the deal, their money's good. If they refuse to shake your hand, it's because they're a fairy, so you don't take them. Do any of you ever spit and shake hands on a regular basis? No. Actually, I do have to tell you about a lady I came across just on one occasion. Of all the years I've been asking people this question, there's just one person I truly believed really did this every single day, and she was a very elderly woman from Belfast. You all know Belfast, Northern Ireland? When I started talking about this, she got really enthusiastic and she said, oh, I do that all the time. But her daughter was sat next to her and said, yes, she does. So I knew that it was true. And I asked her out of curiosity, I said, have you ever gone home and opened your purse or your wallet and found dust in there instead of money? And she said no. So it works. Just something to consider. So that was the trooping fairies. But then, of course, we had the solitary fairies. And the most famous of all the solitary fairies that we have today is, of course, the leprechaun. But believe me, the leprechaun we have today, he is very far removed from the leprechaun that we had in Irish folklore. In Irish folklore, he was a very dark, very sinister character. the leprechaun had two jobs. He was the keeper of the fairies' treasure, and he was the shoemaker for the fairies. There are many, many stories about people who came across the leprechaun and they tried to get the gold of the treasure. One of those stories is from County Kilkenny, which is my homeland, and it's all about a man named Sean Fitzgerald. Now, Sean was walking through a forest called Woodstock in Innisteed, County Kilkenny, and it was a beautiful sunny day. The sun was shining and there wasn't a sinner in sight. As he walked along, he started to hear a coming from behind a bush. So he looked in behind the bush and he saw this leprechaun tapping away at a shoe, and he thought, brilliant, I'll catch the leprechaun, I'll get his gold. So he crept up on the leprechaun and he grabbed him and he said, tell me where your treasure is. And the leprechaun tried to distract him, get him to look here, look there, because if you look away from the leprechaun for even a second, he'll be gone. But no, Sean kept his eyes on him all the time, and eventually the leprechaun said, all right, I'll show you where my treasure is. So he brought him through every bit of bogland and a bunch of nettles and thorns and thistles and the entire forest, until eventually they got to a big tree. And the leprechaun said, now, this is where my treasure is buried. At that point, Sean realised he didn't have a spade. So he took a long red ribbon from his pocket, he wrapped it around the tree, and then he looked the leprechaun straight in the eyes and he said, you promise me now, promise you will not remove the red ribbon from that tree. And the leprechaun said, oh, I promise. At that point, Sean darted back to his house as fast as he could, grabbed a spade, started running back to the forest. As he approached the forest, he noticed something. Each and every one of the trees had a red ribbon wrapped around it. And that is a typical example of the kind of stories we have about the leprechaun. I don't know of anyone who managed to actually get the gold in the end. If somebody did, then they were very quiet about it afterwards. But as I said, the leprechaun in Irish folklore was very dark and very sinister. And he's changed, I believe he's changed because of Irish emigration. Because when Irish immigrants, when those of you who've got ancestors who left Ireland and they went to America or Canada or Argentina, as we discovered, they were leaving with nothing to their names. And essentially they were going to their destination to try and find their gold, try and find their treasure. So what better things to talk about than to talk about the leprechaun and that chance of catching a leprechaun and getting his gold. And if you look at the image we have of the leprechaun today, you know, he's got the hat, he's got the pipe, he's got the little brogues and the tailcoat. If you compare that with images of Irish immigrants arriving in Newfoundland or in Ellis Island, wherever they happen to land, that's how they were dressed at the time. So he has evolved into the sort of Lucky Charms character we have now today, and a lot of Irish people see that as a negative thing, but I think in a way it's kind of nice. I think it shows that Irish folklore is still moving along with us, and why shouldn't it? And Lucky Charms are quite tasty as well, so it's all good. So that was the leprechaun, but I do have to tell you, growing up in Ireland, I was told very little about the leprechaun. What I remember quite vividly being told about is the banshee. So if you've heard of the banshee before, the banshee was the harbinger of death. She would inform you of a death coming up in the family. Not a very popular fairy. Very few people ever actually saw her, but the descriptions we have say that she had long grey hair down to her feet, a long cobweb-like dress, grey wrinkled skin and eyes that were red and bloodshot from thousands of years of grieving. But of course, it's the sound that she made that she was famous for. She made a keening sound, and that was like a crying, wailing sound. If you heard the banshee making that sound outside your house at night, that meant that somebody in the household was going to die in the very near future. So it was definitely not something that you wanted to hear. So the banshee, not the most popular of all the fairies, but the most mischievous of all the solitary fairies, was by far the puka. And the puka could take a number of different shapes and forms, but usually he was seen as a big black horse with fiery yellow eyes. And the puka particularly enjoyed tormenting men walking home from the pub at night. Now, obviously in 19th century Ireland, there were no street lights of any description. So these men, they'd just be walking down these dark country lanes all by themselves, just trying to get home for the pub. What the puka would do, this big black horse would creep up behind him, sweep him off his feet, take him on a crazy journey around the country, and then dump him in a bush somewhere. It's all making sense now. So, obviously, you know, today these stories are kind of fun. They're a little bit silly to us, but in 19th century Ireland, sometimes they really served a purpose, because they would actually make people think before they did silly things or make foolish decisions. I mean, John, are you enjoying a little tipple tonight, a little drink?
Maybe.
Yeah.
Yes, definitely.
If you were in a little country pub somewhere, you're not in the Brazen Head in Dublin, but a little country pub, and you've had a hard day on the farm with Bessie the cow, so you're having a few drinks, and they're flowing, and you're really enjoying them, and everybody's saying, come on, John, we'll bring you home. But you're saying, no, I'll walk by myself. But then they say, oh no, come with us or the puka will get you. Would it be
I'm not messing
easier?
with the puka. Yeah, I'm definitely going with Rob and
Sure.
Yeah.
I'm entirely convinced about that, are you? I don't know. But you know what though? It wasn't just farmers like John that these stories would protect. Your name is Farmer John from now on.
That's fine. That's good.
But it wasn't just farmers like John these stories would protect, but with children, you could tell a child, oh, don't talk to strangers, that could be a leprechaun. Or if there was a river near your house and you didn't want the child to swim in the river when you're not supervising, so tell them that there's evil fairies in the water, and they wouldn't go in there then. And of course, we had to protect our children from being kidnapped by the fairies, which would happen. And what the fairies would do is they would take your child and replace your child with a changeling fairy who looked just like your child, but their behaviour would have changed quite drastically. So if your child was misbehaving or acting unusual, clearly that was not your child. You had changing on your hands, your child was the fairy. But for some reason, we don't really know why, but for some reason, the fairies would kidnap boys a lot more often than girls. So, in order to try to protect your son, you would try to confuse the fairies by dressing your son in a girl's dress until they were about 9 years of age. And there's a picture just there with a group of boys. As you can see, they all have dresses. Of course, we do have a young gentleman in the room. What's your name, sir? Aidan. And what age are you, Aidan? 9. So you're just about okay. Because I do have a spare dress upstairs if you want to know. I think you're okay. Just stick with it. You'll be fine. So, even though children in 19th century Ireland, even though parents were not around to supervise them all the time because they were so busy working in the fields, but because of these stories, children didn't really venture into the unknown. So they were actually quite safe and quite protected. Just maybe a little bit mentally screwed up in the head. And today, of course, we really romanticize the fairies, and that's why I always have to say that this is not Tinkerbell. These are not the pretty little winged fairies. These fairies were feared and respected. And that respect is still very strong in Ireland because we still respect the fairies' habitat. And the fairies have two different kinds of habitat in Ireland, fairy forts and fairy trees. And I'll tell you about the forts first of all. These are circular dwellings that Irish people used to live in at a time when the Vikings were raiding the country. We would try to protect ourselves by living in this circular dwelling surrounded by stone walls or bushes. But when it got safer, it's believed that the humans moved out and the fairies moved in. And you do not disturb a fairy fort for love nor money. Not worth it, because dreadful things will happen if you do. And the same then goes for the fairy trees. Usually these are hawthorn trees and they've got a lovely white blossom in the springtime. And it's believed that the fairies dance around these trees to celebrate the coming of spring. Just like the forts, do not disturb the tree, do not cut the tree down, just leave it well alone. This respect for the trees even goes so far as to when we plan our infrastructure in Ireland. And this is just one example, but back in 1998, there was a road being built in the west of Ireland, in County Clare. The original plan for the road involved going straight through a tree called the Latoon tree, which is a very important fairy tree. So a man named Eddie Lenihan, he's a very famous Irish storyteller, he got some protesters together to protect the tree. the protest got so big, it wasn't just in the local newspapers, it was in the New York Times. And the county council had to give in after 2.5 years of protesting. So if you're on this road in County Clare, you'll see that it goes straight, 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 around the fairy tree, straight, straight, straight. And the trees. Cost an extra $1 million in taxpayers' money, but it was worth it at the end of the day to protect the tree. So, as you can see, the respect for the fairies is still very, very strong. Now, I am not saying that if you talk to Irish people on your travels around the country and ask them, do you believe in the fairies? I'm not saying they're going to say yes. The response you get with most Irish people would be, well, that's in the past. But if you find an Irish farmer, and maybe he's got a fairy tree on his land, and you offer him all the money in the world to build on that land and destroy the tree, you're not going to have a chance. Because his response to you is going to be, I'm not touching that. My father didn't touch it, my grandfather didn't touch it, my great-grandfather, and so on. So why meddle with it? If you're going to be on either side of the fairies, you might as well just be on their good side and play it safe. I think what really sums it up is there was a woman in the west of Ireland who was a wonderful Shanachie, a wonderful storyteller. And a researcher was gathering stories from her and asked her straight out, do you believe in the fairies? And the woman, the Shanachie, had to actually go away and think about it for a few minutes. And when she came back, she said, Ara, I don't. But they're there anyway. And that's how it is. So I hope you're going to respect them from here on in. Now, I'm going to finish up this section with a little bit of a song. And this song is called My Lag in Love. And I like this song because it mentions my favourite fairy of them all, the Lianan She. The Lianan She was the fairy mistress. And essentially what she did was she would seek the love of men, make them fall madly, head over heels in love with her, until they just wasted away. I like her style. So I'll just sing a little for you. Like in stream sings lullaby that blows on leaf the twilight gleam is in her eye. The night is on her hair, and like a lovesick lemon she hath my heart in thrall. No life I owe, no liberty, for love is Lord of I'll give you a little reminder about the rest of the evening. Obviously, you know that your main courses will play in a few moments and the musicians will play for you for a little while. Again, when you finish your dessert and your tea and coffee, don't run away because it will come back afterwards and tell you some more stories. While you're having your main courses, I'm just going to let this little form that I have here pass around the room, and if you like you can put your name and your email address down on the form, and in a few days time I'll send you on some of the stories I've told you this evening along with a few others and a list of books I'd recommend as well if you want to learn more. I'm not entirely sure whether it's the fairies or the Guinness or what it is, but sometimes it's a little tricky to read the email addresses. So if you can put everything in big capital letters, that'd be great. And don't worry, it is me sending the email, not a company that's going to send you lots of spam or anything like that. So don't worry about that. So we'll let that pass around the room after your dessert. I'll back to you then. Okay, enjoy your food.
I taste the light biscuits on the back. Martin Brady family, morning rain and early. The root of a do of a dog. Born that you, born that you, it's 50 years ago. With your root of a do of a dog. Born
really make people think before they did silly things or make foolish decisions. I mean, John, are you enjoying a little tipple tonight, a little drink?
Maybe.
Yeah.
Yes, definitely.
If you were in a little country pub somewhere, you're not in the Brazen Head in Dublin, but a little country pub, and you've had a hard day on the farm with Bessie the cow, so you're having a few drinks and they're flowing and you're really enjoying them, and everybody's saying, come on John, we'll bring you home. But you're saying, no, I'll walk by myself. But then they say, oh no, come with us or the puka will get you. Would it be
I'm not messing